Hi, I have a special video today. I want to show everyone how I use my Nikon Z9 for event photography. I've had this Nikon Z6 II for the longest that I've used for event photography, and I want to integrate this Z9 into my event photography business. So in today's video, I want to focus on how the Nikon Z9 did in multiple low light situations. Is the Nikon Z9 overkill for event photography? Watch this video to find out. Recently, I had the opportunity to photograph two cultural events and a small wedding with the Nikon Z9 and the Nikon Z6 II. My name is Vaughn, and I'm an event photographer. If you watched any of my previous videos with the Nikon Z6 II, go to the link above, then you would know the ins and outs of using the Nikon Z6 II in low light. Please watch the end of the video for some tips on how to use the Nikon Z9 in low light. You just might need them for your event photography. Now let's start with the ISO settings for the Nikon Z9. The Nikon Z9 has a 45 megapixel sensor versus a 24 megapixel sensor for the Nikon Z6 II. With the Nikon Z9 having a 45 megapixel sensor, ISO noise creeps in at higher ISOs. I expected this because I previously had a Nikon D800 for photography, but I finally gave up on this camera due to it having grainy photos above 1600. There just wasn't any good noise reduction software back then like Topaz Denoise or DxO ProRAW, and I'm not sponsored by any of these companies. These slightly grainy photos represent the beginning stages of my photography portfolio. These photos were taken about 8 years ago in the DSLR Halcyon days. Look at them, they're just wonderful. They're all wonderful. Today, with these higher ISO mirrorless cameras like the Nikon Z9, my solution is to use a lower shutter speed. The Nikon Z9 has 6 stop stabilization, so a lower ISO is possible without a slower shutter speed. Added flash, and you have less grain because the sensor can capture more light. When you are photographing in lower light situations at events, you have to change the shutter speed constantly. I can use aperture priority, but sometimes it just doesn't keep up with changing situations at an event. 1 minute someone's giving a speech, and then they start pacing the floor. Aperture priority has trouble with erratic movement. Plus, your settings, if they're on spot on, then the autofocus will have issues. I'm a manual photographer because I just don't trust the camera to give me the optimal settings I need. If you're an auto mode photographer, you might want to go full manual. That's just my opinion. You'll find that your hit rate will improve and you won't be able to blame the camera when your photos of someone's wedding march turn into a collection of soft photos. That has happened to me before. Leave those comments if you trust your camera's auto settings. Everyone wants to know. Now let's talk about the use of flash photography. This is one of the subjects that creates a divide in the event photographer community. Most of the natural or ambient light photographers dislike using flash. They say that flash makes photos look harsh or artificial. I use flash to fill in shadows. Also, by using flash, you can lower your ISO settings, and that's one of the great things about using flash. Lower ISO, less grain. I personally like to use flash because with a maximum flash sync speed of 1/200 on the Nikon Z9, I have the range to capture most static shots. But when there is a fluid motion, like on the dance floor or a scene with colorful lights, I turn off the flash and use the ambient light. At weddings, if I'm using a 70 to 200 millimeter lens from a distance, then flash is necessary due to the light fallout. So There is a balance of when to use ambient light and flash. It's just a matter of preference. Next, this subject is a major hot topic. Do 45 megapixel sensors create more noise than lower megapixel cameras? Most event photographers recommend 24 megapixel cameras like this Nikon Z6 II. What do I recommend? The camera that's in your hand. Please subscribe to my channel to receive more content like this for photographers, so you can learn more about Nikon cameras or just mirrorless cameras in general. So in my short time in event photography, I used a Nikon D800 with a 45 megapixel sensor. Back then, my composition skills honestly were just bad. I could crop a photo and still end up with a 24 megapixel file. Now let's move to my recently sold Nikon D3S. The buyer was nice enough to leave a comment on my channel. Thanks for the purchase. The Nikon D3S had a 12 megapixel sensor. So was the lower megapixel an issue? No, clients don't notice the difference between a 45 megapixel photo versus a 12 megapixel photo. I've had viewers criticize my photos because they looked at them on a low-res phone or monitor and basically said, they suck. Now that I have the Nikon Z9 with improved technology, will it have more noise than D800? Look at the chart from Proton To Photos. I've added 2 additional cameras that I've owned. With the noise comes an unrecognized issue that beginners face when determining how much noise you want in your photos without post-processing. The Nikon Z9 uses a 2,089 dot LCD screen, which makes you overconfident when you're chimping those low light photos. This display disguises grain very well. So what this does is it makes your psyche think that you can crank up the ISO to take higher ISO photos. Take for instance this photo at 3200 ISO. I went without a flash to capture the background lighting. This is what it looks like on the LCD screen. Now in X Studio, big difference. So be careful when you're not using a flash with a Nikon Z9, or all your precious event photos will have to be denoised, which takes more time than drinking a cup of coffee. So does a 45 megapixel sensor equal a 24 megapixel in noise? Yes, if you use denoise software like Topaz or even Adobe Denoise, it will correct your noise to the level of a 24 megapixel sensor. Now let's talk about something that is less technical. The weight of the Nikon Z9. At 3 pounds, it's at the top of the weight class for flagship mirrorless cameras. I had a 6-hour event where I had to lug around this camera with a flash bracket, this flash, and this LED light. And on the other side, my Nikon Z6 II. Did this wear me down? The first few hours were okay, but the last 2 hours I started to suffer from head and back fatigue. So I switched my setup so that the Nikon Z6 II was the A camera and gave the Z9 a rest. But the Nikon Z9 battery didn't get low till after 4.5 hours, while the Nikon Z6 II, I had to change batteries after 2 hours. So if you add the Nikon Z9 setup, think about the weight on an extended shoot. This is the reason why the Nikon Z8 has become so popular. You get a 2-pound Z9 for $4,000. That's what I call a bargain. Finally, my favorite part of the video, the different modes of the Nikon Z9. For this test, I will use the Nikon Z9 with a native lens, the Nikkor Z40mm f2.0. It's a prime lens, so it will focus fast. So in this test, I will also use the autofocus modes most Nikon users are familiar with when using Nikon cameras. All autofocus modes will use the same lighting with auto ISO. So let's begin with single autofocus. This mode is used for portraits and stationary objects. I use it at events to take photos of the decorations or someone just posing and just staying stationary. So for this test, I'll start at an ISO of 3200 and move the ISO all the way up to 25,600. I know you'll probably never use an ISO this high, but I want to show you how well the Nikon Z9 focuses in low light. Now let's move on to AFC, or continuous autofocus, with single point autofocus. This autofocus will only focus where the point is positioned. Let's switch to my most used autofocus point on the Z9, human subject detection. Subject detection is available in several modes on the Z9. There is wide area AF, small and large, where you can customize the size of the box to fit your needs. This works great when you want to isolate subjects from a crowded room and you just want to keep them in a box and you don't want the other people interfering with the focus. Moving on is the subject detection people. This is great when you want to let the camera decide the subject. The camera usually picks the subject in the center of the frame. But if it doesn't choose the right subject, you can always switch it. And I saved this autofocus mode for last, 3D tracking. In this mode, you can place the autofocus point where you want the camera to track continuously. I use this to track brides walking down the aisle or singers at a concert that are very energetic because they're moving all over the place. And usually if you use a subject detection, autofocus, you'll lose them sometimes. So I like 3D tracking. Oh yeah, and the best tip of all is the starlight mode. So if you're in a dimly lit area and you just need a little bit more light for your camera, this mode brightens the display and it lets the camera focus down to negative 8.5 EV versus the native negative 6.5 EV. That just might help you get the shot. I want to show you what a shot looks like with starlight and that high ISO. Here it is. What do you think? Leave those comments. Another tip is to make sure you change the camera's release mode. Don't make the mistake of being in a single shot mode because you'll miss some shots. It's happened to me before. So practice your tracking skills before you actually go to the event. That's my #1 tip. In my final opinion, was the Nikon Z9 overkill for event photography? Maybe. After the adrenaline wore off and the tingling in my hands went away, I had time to ponder whether the better AFC and the multiple custom buttons and the longer battery life saved me valuable downtime. Plus the expense of this camera, was it worth it? Usually with the Nikon Z6 II, I was stuck in single point autofocus mode in low light situations, and I couldn't trust the other modes in higher ISOs for auto tracking, so, oof. And using that focus box and moving around was such a hassle. The Nikon Z9 is a beast, literally. If you don't like taming a beast, stay simple and get you a Nikon Z6 II. Watch my other videos on Nikon cameras, and thank you for watching.